The worst is behind us. That's what the CEO of one of the most powerful banks in the world told shareholders in April 2008. 5 months later, his company would cease to exist. I'm talking about Lehman Brothers, a bank with 158 years of history that survived the American Civil War, two world wars, and the Great Depression and still collapsed in a single weekend. This is the story of how that happened, but it's also the story of how a handful of decisions, made by a handful of people, nearly brought down the entire global economy. And the scariest part is that almost nobody, not even inside the company itself, saw it coming. It all started far from Wall Street. In 1844, a German Jewish immigrant named Henry Lehman opened a small dry goods store in Montgomery, Alabama. A few years later, his brothers Emmanuel and Mayer joined him, and the business became Lehman Brothers, starting out buying and selling cotton, literally accepting bales as payment from local farmers. Over time, the company moved away from cotton and further into finance, relocating to New York and becoming a member of the New York Stock Exchange by 1887. For most of the 20th century, it was a conservative, mid-sized bank, nowhere near the giant it would eventually become. The turning point came in 1984. Shearson, already controlled by American Express since 1981, acquired Lehman Brothers' Kuhn Loeb for $360 million. Only 10 years later, in 1994, it became independent again, now under the leadership of an executive who would become famous, or rather, infamous, for what came next. Richard Dick Fuld. Fuld ran Lehman for 14 years, and for much of that time he was seen as a genius. Under his leadership, the bank grew aggressively, betting on a high-risk model, borrowing enormous amounts of money every single day to fund its operations. Starting in 2006, though, that strategy took a dangerous turn. Lehman began investing more and more heavily in real estate-related assets, right as that market started rotting from the inside. Between 2000 and 2007, Lehman's assets more than tripled, reaching $691 billion. But the most dangerous part wasn't the size, it was the leverage. The bank was operating at a ratio of up to 40 times its own shareholder equity. For every dollar Lehman actually had, it had borrowed 40. A small drop in the value of its assets could wipe out its entire capital cushion. And there were people inside the company trying to sound the alarm. Madeline Antonchik, Lehman's chief risk officer from 2004 to 2007, repeatedly tried to convince Fuld to reduce the firm's exposure to mortgage risk. She failed. According to her, at the senior level there was so much pressure to grow that internal controls started coming apart. In March 2008, the first warning sign exploded. Bear Stearns, a much smaller investment bank, nearly collapsed and had to be rescued at the last minute by the U.S. government and bought by J.P. Morgan Chase. A lot of people on Wall Street breathed a sigh of relief after all. If the government saved Bear Stearns, surely it would save any bank too big to fail. That exact belief is what would lead Lehman straight into disaster. It was in that climate of false security that Fuld told shareholders in April that the worst is behind us. But the numbers told a different story. In June, Lehman announced quarterly losses and replaced its president and its CFO. It was the first public sign that something was deeply wrong on the inside. And it's worth remembering that line of Fuld's, because it's going to come back to haunt him. The worst, in fact, hadn't even started yet. In August, a flicker of hope appeared. Lehman shares rose on reports that the state-owned Korea Development Bank was considering buying a stake in the company. The talks fell apart. Without that investment, Lehman ran out of time and out of options. That's when the weekend that would change financial history began. On Friday, the 12th of September 2008, Wall Street executives were summoned to an emergency meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, with one simple and desperate goal: find a buyer for Lehman before markets opened on Monday. Fuld was betting everything on Bank of America. But without his knowledge, Bank of America was already in secret talks with another troubled firm, Merrill Lynch. By Saturday, it was clear Bank of America would choose Merrill Lynch, not Lehman. That left the British bank Barclays, which had shown interest. But British regulators refused to approve the deal in time without guarantees from the U.S. government. And the government, unlike what it had done with Bear Stearns months earlier, decided not to put public money behind Lehman. To this day, economists still argue over why that decision was different. There are at least three competing theories. The first, the government feared moral hazard that rescuing every troubled bank would teach Wall Street it never needs to be careful, because a bailout will always be there. The second, unlike Bear Stearns, Lehman didn't have enough collateral to guarantee an emergency loan, which would have made a rescue legally impossible. The third, more political. Staging a second multi-billion-dollar Wall Street bailout right before a presidential election would have been politically toxic. None of these theories has ever been proven as the definitive reason, and it's that lack of a single answer that still fuels the debate today. On Sunday night, it became final. There would be no buyer and no bailout. Fold stayed in his 31st floor office until nearly dawn, signing documents while watching the stock price collapse on the screen. At 1:45 a.m. on Monday, the 15th of September, 2008, Lehman Brothers Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in New York. The filing listed $639 billion in assets and more than $600 billion in debt, by far the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history, 4 times bigger than WorldCom's in 2002. The stock, which had closed Friday at $3.65, opened Monday at 21 cents. By Tuesday, it wasn't even tradable. The effect was immediate and violent. That same day, the Dow Jones fell more than 500 points, closing at 10,917. Roughly $700 billion vanished from retirement funds around the world within days. The next day, the government had to bail out AIG. A day after that, a money market fund broke the buck, losing value below what had been invested, almost unheard of. The commercial paper market, which companies worldwide rely on to fund day-to-day operations, simply froze. Within 3 weeks, Congress would pass TARP, a massive bailout package meant to stop the entire financial system from collapsing. Months later, Fold was called to testify before Congress. Bankruptcy investigators had already found something strange. Lehman had been using an accounting maneuver called Repo 105 to temporarily move up to $50 billion off its balance sheet every single quarter end, something that should have been disclosed to regulators but never was. Asked about it, Fold testified under oath. I have absolutely no recollection whatsoever of hearing anything about Repo 105 transactions. The same man who, months earlier, had been so sure the worst was behind them, now claimed he couldn't remember almost anything. Today, Fold and Lehman are remembered as the ultimate symbols of the greed and reckless risk-taking that nearly destroyed the global economy. The line, "The worst is behind us," became one of the most quoted ironies of the 2008 crisis because the worst, in fact, hadn't even started. Lehman's collapse led to the Dodd-Frank Act, created to prevent a single private bank from ever putting the entire financial system at risk that way again. But whether letting Lehman fail was the right call is still debated today. What this story leaves us with is simple and uncomfortable. A 158-year-old bank that survived wars and depressions was destroyed not by one single mistake, but by an entire culture of overconfidence, out-of-control leverage, and the belief that someone would always show up to save everyone. This time, nobody did. Leave a comment. Do you think the Lehman Brothers meltdown is a thing of the past? Or is the economy still showing signs that another collapse like it could happen? And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel.